Good evening and welcome to the May 2026 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. Our guest this evening is journalist Mark Bowden, author of Black Hawk Down and many other wonderful nonfiction books. Before we get to our conversation, let me read you briefly Mark's biography. Mark Bowden is a contributing writer to The Atlantic. His many books include Black Hawk Down, Way 1968, and The Finish, The Killing of Osama bin Laden. His book Black Hawk Down, a finalist for the National Book Award, was the basis of the film of the same name. His book Killing Pablo won the Overseas Press Club's 2001 Cornelius Ryan Award for Book of the Year. Among his other books are Guests of the Ayatollah, an account of the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, which was listed by Newsweek as one of the, quote, 150 books of our times. His other books include The Best Game Ever, the story of the 1958 NFL championship game, Worm, which tells the story of the Conficker computer worm based on an article, The Enemy Within, published in the magazine, The Finish, The Killing of Osama bin Laden, and Way 1968. Bowden has received the Abraham Lincoln Literary Award and the International Thriller Writers True Thriller Award for Lifetime Achievement. A reporter and columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer for more than 30 years, Bowden has also been an adjunct professor at the University of Delaware. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
You're welcome, Don. I'm glad to be able to do it.
I'm looking forward to this. I've admired your work for a very, very long time, and you and I've interviewed you a couple of times for a couple of articles. You've always been very kind to me. I'm excited to talk about your work and your process. And I wanted to begin. You were a working journalist for many years before you wrote Black Hawk Down. I was curious how the remarkable success of that book and the subsequent movie affected your professional career moving forward. Did it have any kind of a significant impact on you?
It sure did. I mean, it was success beyond my wildest expectations or dreams. And, I was a newspaper reporter, and Gail and I lived off of my income as a reporter. And then suddenly I was making more money than I ever imagined I would make. I could write for any publication that I wanted to. Magazines that had ignored my requests or my proposals for years sought me out. They wanted me to write for them. So pretty much from that point forward, um, if I screwed up badly, you can blame it on me because nobody was giving me assignments anymore. I was doing exactly what I wanted to do.
Did what did you find most challenging with Black Hawk Down, the research or the writing? And you had written books prior to, though, is that correct?
Yeah, I'd written two books prior, which were purchased by members of my immediate family. Uh, you know, it was a high level of difficulty, both in the reporting and the writing. And, I had the advantage of having worked as a reporter for the Inquirer for many years, and I had done a lot of foreign reporting. So when I saw those images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, I'm sure most of us who saw those, who remember it, were were shocked and horrified and wondered how in the world that happened. And because I had all this experience of foreign reporting, I felt like that was a question I might be able to answer. And like most of my projects, I had no idea how to do it. You just start, and it was a 5, 6 year long journey. I always say that if you write true stories, half of the fun and half of the story is the reporting, the journey you take to arrive at your own understanding, so that you can get to the point of telling what you feel is a legitimate account. And of course, very little or none of that effort goes into the story itself. The story is the end product. So, um, you know, I've I've often felt I could write a book about every book that I wrote. I don't think anybody would want to read it,
I would.
but it was amazing. I mean, it was a journey, and there were failures and frustrations, and there were moments of just like, I can't believe that I'm so lucky, that this happened the way that it did. But yeah, it was a great experience. And
But let me ask you though, Mark, how do you prepare for a big book project like that, or Way 1968, which is a very comprehensive accounting of the Battle of Way in South Vietnam during the Tet Offensive in 1968? What are your first steps when you finally decide this is a topic I want to write about?
I think the first step is to read everything you can find that has already been done about whatever it is you're working on. And, in the case of Black Hawk Down or Killing Pablo or Way, 1968, very little had been written, but there were things out there. There was even an attempt at a book written many years ago. The value in that is, first of all, you get a sense of what's already out there, and you start jotting down names of people, because the goal for me is always to find the people who were directly involved and go sit down and listen to them and ask questions and start piecing together the story in that way. So that's my first step, is to look at what's already out there.
Is this the same approach you take with your magazine work as well, or is your approach to shorter nonfiction a little bit different?
It's a little bit different. Generally, for a magazine piece, it's focused very specifically. So I think actually, now that I think about it, yeah, it is pretty much the same. I think I look at there's often not a lot out there, but say for instance the book Worm, which was about the Conficker computer virus. I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal on the front page about it, and realizing at the end of the story that I had no idea what it was about. I could not understand anything in the story. And yet there it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So I thought, you know what? I would really like to understand what's going on here. So, again, the story provided me with some leads, some people I could contact. And then you always ask someone when you're interviewing them, who else should I talk to? And that way you get like an exponential growth in potential sources of information, and you just keep plugging away at it. Actually, it becomes a challenge to decide when to stop. When you have learned enough, because I think, and I know reporters from my years in the newsroom who were like this. I mean, they would just fall into a rabbit hole, and they never wrote anything. They just kept learning, and they knew a lot, but they didn't know how to organize it into a story. So yeah, that's how I do it.
You've traveled a lot for the books you've written. Mogadishu for Black Hawk Down. You went to Tehran for Guests of the Ayatollah. You went to Vietnam for Way 1968, and others as well. Um, how difficult were those trips from a journalistic perspective? Meaning going to these places, trying to find the people that you needed to talk to, the process of making those interviews happen. Could you talk a little bit about doing your research in a foreign country like that?
It's hard, and it gets easier with experience. One of the first things I learned is you hire a fixer. You don't plunge into another country and think you're going to manage doing all that work on your own. You need to find someone who's a guide, who speaks the language, who in ideal circumstances is somewhat familiar with the story that you're working on, and you collaborate on finding the people that you need to interview, and they're there with you when you're interviewing. So um, it's Mogadishu was a huge challenge because I did not have a reliable translator or a guide, and nevertheless, it worked out really well. It turns out that people everywhere want to tell their stories. I mean, they are eager to answer questions and have tell their story. And then very often, if you're dealing with something that involves the United States military or intelligence agencies, things that soldiers or spies are inhibited from talking about because they can't. Um, if you go to another country, people will just tell you everything. And I've had a Filipino Marine captain. I was asking him about a raid that he did with the CIA, and I'm asking him all these questions. He said, "Well, I have film of it," and he just opens his drawer and hands me a disc with film of the whole thing. So that would never have happened in the United States. I mean, he couldn't care less about what's classified in the United States.
You've talked a little bit though about the challenges you had in Vietnam, trying to find and talk to the military participants of that particular battle in 1968. How
Right.
did you overcome that? How did you find them? And obviously they're in a the kind of environment where they really can't talk freely, I would imagine a lot of the time, especially with an American journalist.
Mhm.
How did you deal with that?
Well, a lot of time has gone by since the American War, as the Vietnamese call it, and I had a wonderful guide, Hoang Da Hoa, who was a former Vietnamese military officer. He was far too young to have fought in the American War, but he knew his way around the military, and he was also well educated. He spoke fluent English, and so he understood the culture of the military there. He understood he could do work in the archives for me. He actually worked with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick on their Vietnam documentary, which is how I was lucky enough to make his acquaintance. And we just went around. That was my first trip to Vietnam. We would travel around to former Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers who were heroes. They, in their hometowns now, they were celebrated figures because of their, heroism during the war. And so they were very eager to talk about their experience. And, because Vietnam won the war, uh, they're really happy to talk about it. They're eager to share. Now, there were instances, for instance, when and this is recorded in my book, when the North Vietnamese forces took over Hue, they basically owned the city for a number of weeks. And during that time, they probably killed about 1,000 people, executed people. And the Vietnamese government does not want to talk about that. They like to characterize the war as a war to repel the foreign invaders, when in fact it was very much a civil war. And so when they took over the city of Hue, they sought out people who were working for the South Vietnamese government, and in it's as simple a role as driving a bus. And if they were affiliated at all with the South Vietnamese government, they were rounded up and either sent to re-education camps or executed. This was a shameful episode, and one that the authorities were not happy to talk about. Nevertheless, people who live through events like these sometimes feel compelled to tell the truth and to tell what they saw. Brave people, and I was lucky enough to find some.
Mark, did you ever feel unsafe during any of your international travels to research your books? Was there ever a moment where you felt that you were in some kind of a jeopardy, perhaps?
Yes. um, Usually because the truth of being a foreign correspondent is that you don't know what's going on. I mean, you land somewhere, you don't speak the language, you're at the mercy of the people who are guiding you. I was very fortunate in my career to have had wonderful people who have helped me, and they go to great lengths to help you. Mogadishu was terrifying. It was a city in complete anarchy. There was fighting in the city every night. I was not welcomed by the clan that I was investigating, that I wanted to write about. I was warned to leave, and so I was just stubborn and stupid, probably, but stubborn because I spent a hell of a lot of the Philadelphia Inquirer's money to get to Mogadishu and to hire a security detail and a translator, and I did not want to leave because I was a chicken. I thought if somebody shoots at me, I'm going to leave. But thankfully, nobody shot at me. There were moments in Colombia when I was researching Killing Pablo when the FARC and the ELF were still very active. These are revolutionary groups which have since reached agreements with the government, but at the time they were actively kidnapping Americans in particular. So there were areas of the country, particularly up in the mountains, where we had to make sure we left before sunset, because if we were on the roads when the sun went down, we were targets. So that was kind of a dicey place. In Tehran, I was received very warmly by the people, but I knew that at any point the Iranian government could arrest me and throw me into Evin prison. They've done that with other journalists who are reporting there. But I had a very helpful guide who knew his way around, and I felt confident that he would steer me through it, and he did. So, yeah. So I don't seek out moments like those. Believe me, I'm not a courageous person. I, but I want a story. I'm very stubborn. If I want a story, and I know there's only one way to get at what I need, I'm willing to risk a lot to get there.
I'm glad that nothing bad happened to you during those trips.
Me
You've
too.
talked often about the importance of not really knowing what a story is until you get into the story and you start doing your research and talking to people and whatnot. I was curious if you ever, with a particular book, if you ever been surprised as a result of your research that maybe sent a story in a different direction than you may have assumed going in.
All the time. In fact, I think it is one of the characteristics of journalism. I think that if you aren't surprised, or if you don't learn something that you didn't know, you haven't done enough work. And so, yeah, I can cite instance after instance where I ended up in a completely different place than I thought I would when I started. And I don't think that's unnatural. I think that that's actually, if you approach your work honestly, I think, and with an open mind, that's pretty much what has to happen. I can tell you one example. I began writing a story. I called it The Three Battles of Wanat, which was about a small battle in Afghanistan where a young American officer, Jonathan Brostrom, was killed. And what got me in the story was that Jonathan Brostrom's father was a retired Army colonel, and he had instigated an investigation into the events that led to his son's death. And so I imagined that because there was an ongoing investigation, and because of the involvement of the victim's father, that I would be able to get good information about the characters that I was writing about, and also about the battle. So I imagined that I was just going to write a story about this battle where this young officer was killed, and about him, and then about the investigation, which was instigated by the father, ended up essentially indicting the entire chain of command over top of Jonathan's position, from the general on down. And a lot of these officers basically received reprimands, career-ending judgments by this investigation. But as I began working on it, I realized that the investigation was flawed, that it had been steered, really. It hasn't just been instigated, but steered by Jonathan's father. And Jonathan's father had intervened with a lot of high-ranking officers in order to get his son posted in this dangerous place in Afghanistan. His son wanted a combat action badge. He wanted to, that's an avenue to promotion in the military. So the father pulled strings in order to get his son placed there, and then went after some of the same people who had done him a favor in putting his son in that position. And then one or two of the officers, because you don't just get one side of the story. I had to go talk to these commanders who had been reprimanded, and I began talking to them. And I realized that this is a story about a father who was not just stricken with grief, but with guilt, that he had put his son in a position, where his son got killed. And I think he took out his grief, his anger on, the men who had actually helped him get his son put in that place. So it ended up being a far more complex and I think richer story than I imagined when I started.
Wow. Wow. That's a great example. I want to take a half a step back, Mark. You'd mentioned the Philadelphia Inquirer and its role in sending you to Mogadishu. Was Black Hawk Down always intended to be a book, or was it supposed to just be a series in the newspaper that, because of what it was, became a book?
It
Was
was
a
always
was a book the always the end game?
Yeah, it was always intended to be a book. In fact, my second book was published by Knopf, and they had rights of first refusal for my next work. And I had decided that I wanted to write about the Battle of Mogadishu, but Knopf wasn't interested, and I couldn't get a contract for that project. But I, at the same time, was still working at the Inquirer, and my former editor at the Inquirer, Gene Roberts, had become managing editor of the New York Times. He invited me to New York to talk about coming to work for the New York Times, and I ultimately, Gail and I decided that moving to New York was not in the cards. It was a great job. It was a wonderful opportunity, but we had decided not to do it. But the way newsrooms are, word got back to the Philadelphia Inquirer that I had been up in New York, and so the editor of the Inquirer, Max King, called me in his office and he said, "I understand Gene has offered you a job in New York." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'll match it." He told me, "I will match his offer, and if you stay here, you can do anything you want." So I said, "Okay, done." He didn't ask me if I had accepted the job or not. I had already decided not to take the job, but I told him, "Okay, deal. I'll stay here. And here's what I want to do. I want to write this book. So I'll need to take a leave of absence or something." And he said, "Well, why don't you do it for us?" And I said, "Well, it's because, Max, it's a book, and it's going to be, really long." And he said, "Well, how about, if we run it as a serial?" And those who are, avid followers of Black Hawk Down know that it ran initially as a 26-part serial in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And the advantage there for me was that I was on salary. I had all my health benefits. Any travel that I needed to do, like to Mogadishu, was paid for by the paper. It was an expensive undertaking, and it was underwritten really by the Inquirer. The only really smart thing I did was in that conversation with Max. I said, "Well, if I do it for you, you'll own it." And I had in mind that every once in a while the Inquirer would like package a columnist's columns and publish a little book that they had a local publisher and they put it on the counter in stores in and around Philadelphia. And I didn't want that. I wanted a book with a national distribution. I wanted a real book. And so I said to Max, "If I do it for you, you'll own it." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you do it for me, after we run it as a serial in the paper, you own it outright." So honestly, no expectation that this would ever be a valuable project that would be made into a movie and would win awards and whatnot and sell millions of copies. But when Jerry Bruckheimer bought the movie rights to Black Hawk Down, I got a call from a lawyer for Knight Ridder, which was the parent company that owned the Philadelphia Inquirer. And she said, "How can you sell something that you don't own?" And I said, "Well, I do own it." And she said, "Well, didn't you do it on staff?" And I said, "Yes, but I had a deal." And it was a verbal agreement. Max had since left the Inquirer. He was no longer even the editor. But much to Knight Ridder's credit, they honored our verbal agreement. And that was probably the most lucrative step that I ever took in my career. And I'm grateful that they were good about it.
So Hollywood approached you about Black Hawk Down.
Yeah, actually, they bought it off of the series in the newspaper. A fellow named
Oh.
Chad Oman, who was a producer for Jerry Bruckheimer, was fascinated by it, decided to purchase the rights.
Mark, how have you evolved as a writer over the decades that you've been working? Are you a different writer today than you were when you wrote Black Hawk Down?
I hope I'm better. Um, yeah, I mean, you learn. I read a lot, and I pay close attention to writing that I admire. I study it, and I try to learn from it. And I think, one thing that is definitely true is that you begin by writing pieces for the newspaper or maybe even the magazine. But the path in my career has been evolving toward more complex, more difficult subjects, longer pieces. So there's a big difference between writing a 500-page book and writing a 10,000 word magazine article or a 5,000 word piece for the newspaper. You have to become very deliberate about organizing your thoughts and organizing your material, or you get lost in it. So I developed over time, I think, more skill in doing those kinds of things. But I never have changed in my goal, which was to write true stories, to write nonfiction that read like fiction. And that's a big challenge. But there were a lot of writers around back when I started, like Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion and Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, who were doing it. And so I studied their work and I thought, well, this is doable. And I, try practice makes perfect. I did it for a long time.
Those writers you just mentioned are considered the foundation of what in the 60s was called the new journalism, which incorporated aspects of fiction into nonfiction, such as recreating conversations and events that the journalist wasn't there to observe. And you do that remarkably well in all of your books. And you mentioned that a lot of this is because of the access you have to court transcripts, interviews with people who were there, reliable sources, and all that.
Right.
Which brings me to my next question, though, which is that a lot of your books read like action novels. They really, really do. And I mean, it's because you're talking about exciting events where things are happening and a lot of moving parts. But do you approach a moment in your books that might be action oriented differently than you might some other aspect of telling that story? And I'm thinking of Way 1968 in particular, because that's a rolling battle that went on for a really long time. And you talk about specific moments in that battle of combatants going at each other. How do you approach the action like that? Is it, are you conscious of it? Let me put it that way.
I'm not just conscious of it, I build the story around those. I think good storytelling is about characters, action, dialogue. Sometimes writing nonfiction, those things are hard to come by, but you can get there. And I think what if you read Hui, a lot of the action unfolds through the eyes of the various participants, whether they're Vietnamese or American. And there's very little effort in that book to reconstruct dialogue. I mean, I think I'm pretty careful about that. I'm not making anything up. I'll say, for instance, if somebody remembered saying this or remembered saying that. Whereas in many of the books that I've written, including Black Hawk Down, there are transcripts, there's recordings of all this information. So if you know where to look, you can recreate scenes with great accuracy. You're using the actual language that was spoken. Hui was a challenge because there wasn't any of that. So I was relying on individual characters. And people look at you kind of funny if I recognize, for instance, a scene, this is something that is going to be a scene in what I'm writing about. I now need to know everything about that moment. I need to know what time of day it was, what you were wearing, where exactly you were standing, whether it was sunny or whatever. And people kind of look at you strange when you start asking those questions. But I think, one of the skills that I have developed is in recognizing that somewhere down the line, I'm going to write this and I'm going to write it as a scene. What do I need to learn in order to be able to flesh out that scene so that it's fun to read, so that it's fascinating to read? And that, a lot of, and the other thing is that I can come back and ask follow-up questions. It wasn't that easy with the Vietnamese characters. I obviously didn't have as easy a time working with them, and that's a whole another story. I mean, how you do that when you're working in another language. But with Americans nowadays, it's not that hard because you can call them up or Zoom with them or interview them without ever leaving your office.
Have you thought about writing fiction? Do you have a novel in you?
Well, yeah, I have. I've written a number of screenplays, which are basically fiction. So I'm familiar with the process. It's very difficult for me, and I have, as I've gotten older, a decreasing appetite for difficulty. I'm busy enough, I'm enjoying doing what I do, and that's one of the reasons why, I don't think I'll write another book. It's just the level of commitment and time, and it's
It's a
just
year out of your life.
it's not just a year, Donald. It's years,
Yeah.
and I'm 75 this summer. I'm happy with what I've done. Maybe I'll write some fiction, maybe a short story. That would be a good way to
There
start.
you
I,
go.
I used to tell my students who they say they want to write a book, and I say, well, write a chapter. See where that leads. A book is a big, big project.
It is. You have to break it down. You have to make it like 10 magazine articles and you've got a book.
Yeah.
That's how you break it down. I wanted to talk, Mark, about the degree of your editor's involvement
Mhm.
in the creation of the books you write. Are they active in the writing part? Do you show them drafts? Are they involved editors, or do you write your book and then it's on their desk?
In the past, it was I would go out and do my work and write, and then give it to an editor. Um, in more recent years, I've developed relationships with editors who I really respect. And so sometimes, like writing for The Atlantic, my editor there is Cullen Murphy. And sometimes the ideas that I pursue are suggestions that Cullen makes or ideas that emerge out of our conversation. So he will be involved to some extent right from the beginning. Sometimes he'll have a suggestion of how to get at something or where to find certain information. But mostly the reporting and the initial draft is my own. And then when I give that draft to Cullen, he will make very good suggestions about how to improve what I've done, or where I maybe need to find out some more information, or where I have written something that's really kind of boring and that I ought to find a way of saying that more succinctly. An editor is an intelligent first reader. And when you're writing something, the whole goal is to have it digested by a reader, to have a reader engaged and enjoy the process of reading what you've written. And the great thing about a good editor is that that's your first reader. And they can come back to you and tell you, where you've succeeded and where you've failed, or where, you might have a better, you might tell a better story if you move things around a little bit differently. I'll give you an example. When I wrote Black Hawk Down, the first draft of that book had about a 60-page long introductory chapter, because my thinking was I can't just plunge the reader into the middle of a battle in Somalia without telling them why this happened and who these soldiers were and why they were there. And so I had 60 pages of setting the context, setting up the scene, and then boom, the helicopters take off and the battle starts. And my editor Morgan Entrican said, "Mark, get rid of the first chapter. When the helicopters take off, I can't stop reading." He says, the first 60 pages I can't get through. It's not that interesting to me. And so what I did though was I didn't lose all of that reporting and writing. I cut it up and I inserted it back into the manuscript in the course of the battle. So if I read Black Hawk Down, I can see almost see the seams on the page where I've inserted a block of copy, that was originally part of the introduction to the book. And to me, it just seemed like that would be obvious to everybody. But no one has ever commented on it. So, and the book did pretty well. So I think that Morgan's advice was extremely good. I had an editor. Just one more story about editing. I had a wonderful editor
Please.
named Carolyn White. This is back in the days when I thought I was God's gift to the writing craft, and that I could do no wrong, and I was a genius. And editors who wanted to mess with my copy were fools who didn't understand what I was trying to get at. And Carolyn was wonderfully patient with me, but I remember she would sit down, and we had, in the old days, we had this word processing system called ATEX, and you could take the copy that I had written and what's called H and J-ing it. You know what H and J is? Hyphenate and justify. Most newspaper copy, magazine copy, it reads in columns. And if you look closely, the column is like 10 words across or less. And if the word needs to be hyphenated, it's hyphenated, but it reads in a straight column. So the effect of hyphenating and justifying my copy was to display it. So there were only like 6 or 7 words per line. And Carolyn would take a word out of every single line of what I had written. She would just show me, you don't need this, you don't need this, you don't. And I developed that. I was so impressed. First I was furious, and then I was impressed, and I realized she was right. And I call it squeezing my prose. I do it myself now. I'll array it on my screen, and I still do what Carolyn taught me to do, which is look at it and think about, how can I say this in fewer words? Sometimes you need more words, but most of the time you don't. Most of the time you just want to come directly to the point. So that's another. I've been very fortunate in my career to have had some supremely talented editors who taught me a lot.
That's a great hack, Mark. A great editing hack. It really is. By the way, were you pleased with the movie Black Hawk
Yes, very,
Down?
very much. Yeah.
Were you
Uh,
involved to any degree in its production? I know that writers usually are not invited. I know that's kind of the thing, but did they invite you to set? Did you participate in any way at all?
yes, yes, and yes.
Oh,
When I flew out to Santa Monica to meet Jerry Bruckheimer, he told me that he wanted me to be involved in every aspect of making the movie. He said he wanted to make a movie that was different than any of the other movies he had made, and he wanted to be accurate, almost documentary-like in its feel, and he needed me to be engaged throughout. And I remember leaving his office and thinking, yeah, right. This is what they tell the writer when they fly him in from Philadelphia. But he was true to his word. And I was engaged, I was involved. I wrote the first draft of the screenplay for that movie, which was really sucked, to be honest. And then they hired a real screenwriter who wrote the movie that you actually see. But I was involved in the original planning for the movie. I can remember sitting with the producers and with Ridley Scott, and we decided we were going to take a legal pad and write down every scene in the book that absolutely had to be in the movie. And after about 3 pages of the legal pad, we realized that was never going to happen. And so we had to think harder about how to tell the story on screen. So yeah, I was involved in choosing the location. I was on set in Morocco for much of the time where they shot it. I was involved in post-production, which is a fascinating process where you can do things like add dialogue to scenes, which I had no idea that you could do. But for instance, some scenes are shot from like the back of the actor's head, so you can actually add lines of dialogue because you don't see their face moving. So I was involved in doing that, and I sat with Ridley and Pietro Scalia, who won an Academy Award for his film editing for that movie. And then when the movie premiered, it premiered all over the world. And I was there for a lot of that. We premiered it at military bases all over the country. There were premieres in cities all over America. And then we went to Europe. And I remember, I mean, this is the only time in my life I traveled on private planes, but we would fly from London to Paris to Rome to Madrid. And in every city, we premiered the movie. There would be a lot of press and people invited to the premiere. We would get on stage and introduce the project, and then we would all go out to dinner because it's a 2 hour and 20-minute movie. So we would go out and have a nice dinner somewhere in Paris or London, and then we would come back when the movie was ending. We would get on screen, and then we would answer questions from the audience. So this went on, and now I'm a working journalist, and I have a family. I have 5 kids at home and a very patient wife who's willing to take care of things while I'm off doing this. But at a certain point, I had to tell them we were in Rome, and I just said, guys, they were heading off to Prague and Budapest and points from the Far East. And I said, I'm leaving. And they said, what? You can't leave? I said, no, I must leave. I'm going home. So I remember I flew home and I was pulling the garbage can up to the top of the driveway thinking, man, my carriage has turned back into a pumpkin. And I even went to the Academy Awards. I mean, talk about something that everybody, if you're lucky enough to do, should do once in their life, because you are literally surrounded by the most famous faces in the world. I mean, everywhere you look is someone you know, but you don't know, but you know. I mean, I go to the movies now, and there's very few movies I see where there aren't actors who I haven't met personally. I met Paul McCartney at the in the lobby of the Academy Awards. A wonderful fella. So yes, I was deeply involved. I think one of the things that experience taught me was the big difference between a film and a book. I mean, there's no question that if you want to understand what happened in Mogadishu in 1993, you need to read the book. If you want to be moved and overwhelmed by the power of that experience, watch the movie. The films are really good at conveying emotion, conveying what I want to say, emotion. I mean, they capture the moment, in a way that would be virtually impossible on the page. Even as good a writer as Dickens can't compete with Steven Spielberg when it comes to making audiences cry. So movies are brilliant, but a movie is a short story. If you added up all the words in the script to Black Hawk Down, it amounts to maybe an article in the Atlantic. It's not a 500-page annotated account of what happened. And to me, I was lucky enough that I was old enough when this happened to me that I was not tempted to abandon my profession. I mean, I was being paid so well, and I got paid extremely well to write scripts, and they were fun to do, but it isn't the same as reporting and writing, and so I was not tempted to stray from what I think I'm good at. And I think if I'd been in my 20s, I probably would not have stuck with the reporting and writing. I would have been seduced by Hollywood, but I'm pleased that I was older and I was not.
That is a wonderful story, Mark, and a surprising story too, when you think about how writers generally are treated in Hollywood.
Well,
I was curious, of all your books, you're perhaps best known for Black Hawk Down, understandably because of the movie. Of your entire bibliography, what is the one book that you would most like to be remembered for? Is it Black Hawk Down, or is it one of the others you've written?
hell, I'd like to be remembered for any of them. I tried my best on all of them. I think, in all honesty, Way 1968 is probably the best book I wrote. It was the most challenging, the most difficult to report. I'm very proud of it. But in some ways, I think that my most recent book, Last Sentence, may be the best written book that I've ever done, just because I have so many years of experience now, and I think I know how to tell a good story, and I know how to tell a story more economically than I did when I, say, for instance, wrote Black Hawk Down. Um, so you never stop learning, and hopefully you never stop getting better. So it would make sense that the last book I wrote would be the best written of them all.
That's a good segue to my last question for you, Mark. You mentioned earlier that you've taught writing at various levels, and I was curious, two questions. What have you found to be the most common mistakes that young writers make early in the game? And what advice do you most commonly give those writers?
I think different people make different mistakes. But I think if there was a common mistake, it would be in arriving at an understanding of a story before you really deserve to have that understanding. Um, I was lucky enough to spend many years as a newspaper reporter learning how to be a diligent reporter. And I think that it's hard work and it's fun, and I enjoyed doing it. But young people, I think, don't realize until they start doing the work how much they have to put into it before they're in a position to write anything of consequence about what they want to write. I think they think I've got a book in my mind or I've got a story in my mind, and this is what the story is, and that's the wrong approach. The right approach is I think there's a story there. I wonder what it is, and then start asking questions and listening to people and allowing yourself to be influenced by what you learn. I mean, so that your initial conception of a story can completely change. And it ought to change because, you know more. And anytime you know more, the story is going to be better. I can remember as a young reporter having the often the experience of having a story pretty much in my head. This is what I'm going to write. I understand this story, and then doing one more interview and realizing now I'm fucked. This is not the story I thought it was. And I have, my initial reaction is if sort of your stomach sinks and you think, oh God, I don't have a story. And then on reflection, inevitably, you realize, wait a minute, this is a better story than what I had imagined. I've learned something here that really changes my understanding of it. And it should change how I write it. And so I think the only way you get that knowledge is through experience. It's a visceral feeling that like what I thought was true is not the whole truth or it's not correct. And
That's a holy shit moment where you realize this story is now going in a completely different direction.
yes, so I think that until, as I say, until you've had that experience, it's hard to convince somebody that they need to go through the process in order to get there.
Are you a J school grad, Mark? Did you go to journalism school?
No, no, I went to Loyola College. It was called college then. Now it's university in Baltimore. They didn't have any kind of journalism program, nor was I interested in being a journalist. I was an English major. I wanted to write plays and short stories and novels. And that's where I started reading the work of the new journalists back in the 1970s. And I thought, wow, they're telling true stories and they're using all of the techniques of fiction, and it's really cool. And I was fascinated by the work that if I'd read interviews with writers and about what they had to do in order to get in position to write the story that they wrote. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. But that was a far cry from newspaper reporting. I was the editor of my college newspaper, and that's a whole different story. I used to tell my students at Loyola, don't take my word for it, go look it up. It was probably the worst college newspaper ever published on a campus in America. I had no idea what I was doing. I had fun doing it, but it got me my first job. I was working as a cashier at the supermarket, and I was offered a job at the Baltimore News American because I had been editor of my college newspaper, and I never looked back.
Apropos of nothing, what are your thoughts on Hunter Thompson?
I think he's a very entertaining writer. Uh, he's humorous. He's not a great writer. He's not a great humorist. I think Mark Twain. You can read Mark Twain today, and you just collapse in laughter. It's so funny. Hunter Thompson's humor was very topical. He was very much a product of an era. I think if you lived through the 60s and 70s, you understand where he's coming from, and it's funny. But I think a lot of readers, like young readers today, would have no context for what he's doing. And other than admiring his heroic intake of drugs and his sort of insane presentation, uh, I was never tempted personally to imitate Hunter Thompson.
I I like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I've read it a couple of times, but I read some of bios recently and realized that at the end of the day, Hunter Thompson was just a jerk, especially the way he treated the staff under him at the Rolling Stone. That just troubled me a lot. You know what I mean? Just
Yeah.
people having to stay up literally all night waiting for him to send in page after page. I'm really surprised that they let that continue. And from what I understand, the majority of the staff under him really did not like him because of that. Understandably so, I think.
He was someone who was self-absorbed to a self-destructive extent.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, without question.
to me, I've never written about myself. I think the real world is so much more interesting.
Yeah,
Other people are so much more interesting than I am. I'm more interested in finding out how and why things happen the way they do than in
me
writing
too.
about my own adventures in the hotel room with,
I'm
ether.
just fascinated by people who do interesting things, and I very much want to write about them.
Well, and he became that. I mean, he became the subject of his own writing.
Yeah,
So,
I was enamored in the beginning, but my opinion has changed over the years. Um, Mark, this has been wonderful. Do you mind if we take a quick minute for some group questions? If anyone has any questions for you, Sarah, I see your hand up.
Let me unmute. Thank you, Mark, for being with us. Um, so, the best stories incur the greatest risk of telling them, and you're a father of five who chose to risk your life to go to these other parts of the world to tell these stories. To me, there has to be some kind of mantra or justification on your end, which like is a why. Like, do you have a why that's kind of the root of why you go and tell these stories that makes it worth the risk that you take to tell them?
good question, Sarah. And I really don't know. I mean, I think looking back from where I am now, I don't really understand why I was as driven as I was. I worked really hard for a long time, and I was willing to go to lengths that a sensible person in some instances probably would not. Um, I wanted to be really good, and I wanted to do things that attracted attention. And my mother died earlier this year. She was 100 years old. I'm one of 8 children, and so part of it, I think, is I was trying to impress my mom. I really, when you're one of 8, you want her attention. And I remember one of my brothers. I was telling my brother this just recently, and he says, "Mark, I think you impressed her." But that's all I can offer. I don't know why. I mean, I have so many wonderful friends who are great reporters and writers and journalists, and I compare myself to them in that I know that I was more focused and driven than a lot of them. And I'm also very fortunate in my marriage that Gail was willing to indulge me in doing the things that I did. And I hope I'm paying her back now. But yeah, so that's the best I can do.
Okay,
There's
thank
a question on chat marks. What are your thoughts on the state of journalism today?
you.
Well, it terrifies me. In some ways, I feel like we have gone back to the 19th century when, there were five or six different newspapers being sold on street corners and in every city, and where anything went. I mean, you just made stories up and anything to attract the pennies that people use to buy them. Right now, we've lost the structured world that I grew up in, where serious journalism was careful and was edited, and there were strong efforts made to be accurate, and there was also, I think, a common acceptance in the country that there were certain very reliable sources of information, and in some ways, that wasn't great because getting to positions like the ones that I had were very difficult. I mean, you had to get hired, you had to get promoted, you had to be encouraged, and now anybody can write anything they want and publish anything they want, and that's good. But the downside is that there's no editing, and there's none of the standards that guided reporting and writing are present any longer. So we're in a kind of an intellectual free-for-all. It's very, very difficult, I would think, particularly for young people, to navigate and understand that this is something reliable or this is something that's clearly fake. And it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference between, what's real and what's fake. So, my students would ask me, how do I get to do what you do? And I would tell them, I just don't know anymore how that's done.
Does anyone else have questions for Mark?
Me.
Sue?
Um, I'm a fiction writer, and I like to be a fiction writer because I'm not very interested in reality.
Huh.
So when you said you find fiction writing difficult, I'm just curious to that because it's sort of, different than my thinking. You know what I'm saying?
Well, Sue, I think that the answer to that is that when I'm writing nonfiction, I know it has value. I know that I've done a lot of reporting. I'm usually telling the reader something they don't know and they would otherwise not know. And so that has value. Whether I do that well or not is almost secondary. For me, it's a goal to do it well, so that it's enjoyable to read and easy to understand and easy to follow. But I never get the sense when I'm writing nonfiction that I'm wasting my time. When I write fiction, when I've written screenplays, for instance, it's just, every day you're focusing really hard on something and writing something, and it's hard for me to convince myself that this is worth my time and effort. And that might just be because of the long, success that I've had and the long journey that I've had in writing nonfiction, that I just I can't summon the feeling that what I'm doing
No, I
is
see now. I
worthwhile.
see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Mark, this has been absolutely wonderful. I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. It's been enlightening, it's been informative, it's been entertaining. You're just an awesome writer, and we're very, very proud to and lucky to have you with us tonight. This is the part of our meetings where we share the good news among our membership. I was wondering if anyone had any good news to share. Does anyone have sales to report? I want to, Sarah, I'll get to you in a second. I want to welcome Mandy Howard back to the fold. Mandy was the TAF member for a long, long time. Then she took a side trip, but now she's back, and we're lucky to have her back. Mandy, it's great to see you again.
Thank you. So glad to be back.
Sarah?
A couple things. I'm getting my second academic piece published in an academic journal about schizophrenia. So I'm really excited about that. That's definitely an honor. But then also my poetry book is going to be coming out in probably late June, that I'm getting published through Lisa's Prolific Pulse Press. So it's a poetry book on sonnets, and I've actually drawn some sketches and pictures for it too. So I'm realizing how much work, even though it's a small book, just how much work goes into the final stages. And but it's almost all done. So I'm excited and I'll be trying to do my first book launch soon.
That's awesome. Congrats, Sarah. That's
Congratulations.
wonderful.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay. Oh, Sue, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I've been doing flash fiction contests, and I did a big one with, oh, I told Don about it when we were at the conference. I just thought it was so funny. So, it was 100 words, and out of about 1,000 people, I came in fifth, and then you advance on, and I was like, yay.
That's
And
great.
so I was fifth, and they really give good feedback, and usually, some of it's kind of tough, but this guy was like, "This is amazing! I can't believe you did this!" And he's going on and on. And then you're supposed to say, "This is what you can work on." Well, you could have tweaked it right here, but it really was amazing.
Oh, that's
I
great.
just got
I
such a
have to
big
tell you
kick.
a story, Sue. Now the editors who work with my copy at the Atlantic are, like, in many cases, young enough to be my grandchildren,
Yeah,
and they'll get on
so
the
much
phone
fun.
and they'll work with me and they'll offer this suggestion and that, and I'll tell them, "Look, you've already made a big mistake." And they said, "You know what?" And I said, "Well, you begin by saying, 'This is amazing. What you've done is just incredible.'" And then you
You can't
start
walk it
telling me how
back.
to make it better.
Yeah, you can't walk it back, right? But it was
Mark, we've got some serious issues to talk about.
Yeah, but only after you've told me what a brilliant writer.
Well,
Sue,
and I kept
congrats
I
on
kept
that.
thinking, if you really think that, why am I fifth?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right. Oh, Marcus.
We can't hear you, Mark.
Ah,
Here you go.
hello. I've mentioned many times about this kid's book that I've been writing, and I finally finished it after working on it, thinking about it for a couple of decades. And I put in my first proposal to an editor about a month ago. Haven't heard back, so I guess it's on to the next one. But I just got back from California, where I've been working on a project with a mutual friend of Don and mine. Named Ken Mitroni, who's an animator in California, has been worked for all the major studios. And back in the '80s, we used to do a comic book together. He's running into ageism now, and plus with AI, a lot of AI is taking over a lot of the animation work in Hollywood.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of animators out of work. Ken
Mm.
knows all of them, and he knows writers and animators and so on. So he decided he was going to do a an online story on YouTube and break it into sections. And I'm not sure how he's going to monetize it, but he asked if I could help. And so we had our first story session and went really well. So basically, you know, hopefully I'll be part of this YouTube thing, which just thrills me because it's so much fun to write that stuff. We
Mm.
did 5 comic books back in the '80s.
And they were really funny comic books too. They were really, really, really good. And so,
Checks in the mail. But so what we're going to do is take those 5 books, distill them down, and use the same characters and write a through line for them that will, hopefully just be ongoing. So I can't wait to see it. I've
us
seen
too.
I've seen all the pre drawings and so on, and they look really good.
Well,
And
Mark
Kenny,
worked for Disney, he worked for Pixar, he worked for Steven
Dr-
Spielberg's company,
DreamWorks,
DreamWorks, probably a couple others. He was also very involved in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So Ken has a background in this. And I think if anybody can make this project happen, it's got to be him. And like you said, he knows everybody out there. They're out of work. They're happy to do whatever they can for this. So I think it's
and
going to
they've
be,
offered to do it for nothing, which is
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
So,
But
we'll see.
could turn into something. So
Yeah.
Mark, this goes to show you the vast scope of our membership.
I'm impressed.
Does anyone else have anything to share? Okay, this is wonderful. Mark, again, our sincere thanks for joining us this evening. This was absolutely wonderful. One of our best meetings in a really long time. And we can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Thank you, Don. My pleasure. Good luck,
All right,
everyone.
thank you.